Let's skip up to the Premier League then. Very shortly, we'll be talking about Roy Hodgson, whose tenure may be coming to an end at Crystal Palace this season. But right now, we're going to start with Thomas Tuchel at Chelsea, one of the Premier League's most recent appointments. And Mike, just first of all, talking about Thomas Tuchel, this feels like a very different role for him, because previously he's taken over from Jurgen Klopp at Dortmund, so following on from a great legacy there. Took over at PSG from Unai Emery and largely kept the system, but sort of tweaked it and refined it. But he comes in after Frank Lampard was sacked after a sort of real mixed period. So this is sort of a different kind of assignment, isn't it, for Tuchel?
Yeah, it's a good point, actually. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the jury's out on him in a lot of regards, it seems, because I didn't know an awful lot about Thomas Tuchel before he came to the Premier League. I've only just kind of taken a bit more of a deep dive on him in the last week or so because, you know, we talked about doing him this weekend. So he's a really fascinating character for me. But again, it's one of these that, you know, he comes with this big reputation. He's clearly made an impact in his previous jobs. But then, you know, I was reading an article on The Athletic, for example, talking about, you know, the way that domestic leagues are nowadays. He's kind of lambasted for not winning a title with Borussia Dortmund, which is virtually impossible, you know, very, very difficult alongside Bayern Munich. And then he's lambasted for only winning domestic titles with PSG, where, you know, that's all he can do, really, is win the domestic title, and anything above that's not necessarily expected. So he's a curious manager, and he's what I would like to call a second cycle manager, I suppose. You know, we've had Jurgen Klopp and Pep Guardiola come through, and then you have all these kind of disciple type managers that follow on in the years to come. They're not necessarily the managers that come along with the new ideas, but they build on those new ideas, and there's more of a force of personality alongside it. And I think that encapsulates Tuchel in a nutshell, is that it's his personality that is what leaps out about him. It's the what it must be like to be on the training ground day in, day out with Thomas Tuchel. You know, he's a larger than life character, and it's just all about the players' spirits and how they must feel working underneath him. But he's got this collection of knowledge that he's built up. He's not the sort of manager that thinks things through himself and comes up with his own principles. I think he kind of just cherry picks the best of what he sees everybody else doing. He just wants them as tools to apply as and when. You know, he's quite an elusive manager. He doesn't set up the same way every week. So he kind of comes with this reputation. You know, the hipsters like him. He's come from the German game. You know, high pressing and all of these kinds of, you know, elements to his football that impress a lot of people. But I think it's more about his personality that defines him as a manager.
Yeah, there's been a few things written about him, as you say. I imagine we probably read the same thing on The Athletic, but other articles sort of suggesting that he hates maybe a strong word, he dislikes players who can't think for themselves. He doesn't want players to be robots. He doesn't want them to just turn up, do exactly what they're told. He wants their input. He wants them to, he'll kind of give them a looser brief and then let them expand on it, if you like, because he wants players to be able to use their brain and function in that way, which is, I guess it's kind of refreshing, isn't it, for many of those Chelsea players to have a manager come in and say, right, it's on you.
Yeah, well, I think this possibly speaks to Tuchel's skill set as a manager himself, because I think if it was left to Tuchel to do all the thinking for his players, I don't necessarily think that is his skill set. I think he wants intelligent players on the pitch. You know, he gives them the ideas of the way he wants to set up. I think back to you know, he's a manager that likes to change it up from week to week, and he's more about, he likes to think of individual games like projects for the opposition, but the players need to be able to grasp it quickly. And I think back to even way back to the Darryl Clark podcast that we did, and this, you know, the setting up projects game by game is kind of his baby. I think there's a little bit of that there about Tuchel, but in terms of what happens on the pitch, once that's out there, he comes up with the overall plan, but it's up to the players to kind of fix the problems themselves once they're out on the pitch. You know, the mini problems that he'll kind of take on the overall problem, set them up, but then the players, once they're out there, are expected to be able to think on the feet. And, you know, and he does value improvisation because it's something that comes very, very natural to him. He's a real improviser. real sort of spontaneity to, pretty much everything that he does. And I think it's because that's just so automatic for him. He notices it when other players can act spontaneously and improvise on the pitch, and he values that himself.
And his sports are really good until today, we have to add. A very good defensive solidity to Chelsea, who'd been keeping plenty of clean sheets. But what they'd also not been doing is sort of beating teams out of sight either, not scored more than 2 goals for quite some time in a game. One criticism under Frank Lampard was that they brought in some expensive summer recruits who weren't firing. They couldn't get the best out of them. And so far, Mike, and obviously it's limited. He's not been there all that long, but he's not really managed it yet. The goals are coming from all over the field, and the likes of Timo Werner are not really firing. And, is that something that he will be concerned by, or will he be able to shrug it off, do you think?
I think it's interesting that you bring up the comparisons with Lampard, because I don't think there's a world of difference. I think they're very, very similar types of manager, very similar types of personality. So I'm not surprised. I think the further we go down the line, the more we'll begin to see the similarities with the Lampard reign, with the Tuchel reign. So this shock result that's come out of nowhere, I don't think necessarily when we go back to the Frank Lampard podcast that Lampard was doing a bad job, but he hit a really bad patch. And the worrying signs were the noises that were coming from inside the club, that he'd lost the dressing room. And that was the problem there with Lampard. In terms of Tuchel getting any more or any less, I think what Tuchel does bring different to Lampard is that, I think both of them lead with the same flow state. And it's very much builds on experience and your experiences. And I think Tuchel's advantage over Lampard as a manager is that he comes from the German game that's had a bigger focus on tactical intelligence over the past 10 to 15 years. And he's, coming through the system there. Whereas Frank Lampard, his first, Jose Mourinho coming in at Chelsea was a real game changer for English football in terms of that side, match preparation and the tactical detail and things like that. And I think because of that, because of Lampard's limited exposure by comparison to real sort of tactical detail, I think he's gravitated more towards the people skills, whereas Tuchel likes to take these tactical ideas like tools off other people and implant them in his players. So I think we've seen that in the early stages while he's been at Chelsea, is that, there's a lot more precision, I think, in what Chelsea are doing in terms of the press as a unit. And, there's a clear consistency in the body of work that Tuchel's tried to put across to the players, and he's had a real impact. I don't think Chelsea's overall standards necessarily have hiked that much. It's just been fresh ideas, a fresh voice on the training ground, just an injection of something new. But then you also have to ask the question as this season goes on, and this might be the first red flag, this West Brom game this weekend, is that you play with that intensity. We've got all these new players that have come from abroad, and we're talking about them not necessarily firing on all cylinders yet. First season in the Premier League, you come in mid-season without a pre-season body of work that setting up the players for this intensity of the press, a schedule that even by Premier League standards or English standards is more intense, more congested. We're getting to the back end of a season now, and Chelsea have been consistently, really sort of working hard without the ball to such a level of intensity for 90 minutes, week in, week out. There might be a few more examples of this, especially if they've got one eye on Europe as the next 6 weeks or so play out.
I've got a double question here for you, Mike. I'd like to throw these at you occasionally. Going off what you said there, if Lampard and Tuchel are similar personality types, is the decision, you said to freshen things up and give a fresh voice, which is obviously perfect and has given them the lift they need. But is the improvement necessary more that Tuchel has experience in Champions League and in European competitions, and probably has better, connections with clubs around Europe when it comes to attracting players to Chelsea? And my second part of the question is, in the German league, they often say the English Woche, which is the English week, which means 3 games basically in 7 days. We've had a lot of that recently here for obvious reasons. Does Thomas Tuchel need time in between matches? He's obviously used to that, but does he need more time, especially if he is gearing up for individual opposition? Do you think that on those weeks when Chelsea are playing Saturday, Wednesday, Saturday, that is when we're going to see Tuchel struggle the most?
I think to answer the second part of that question first, I think Tuchel will relish the intensity of the English schedule as a himself. It's not necessarily got experience at it, but I think he will. He's an adrenaline junkie, basically, and the sooner, the thicker and faster the games come, the more it suits his personality. I think he's a type of personality that gets bored very easily, and I think the more games, the better as far as he's concerned, which doesn't necessarily mean he's going to hit the ground running at being able to perfect these turnarounds and be able to deal with this fixture congestion. But I don't think it will make him feel uncomfortable. I think he'll be entirely comfortable with it. I think the way he the way I separate him most from Frank Lampard is that I think Thomas Tuchel's more proactive than Lampard was. I think Lampard's reactive. I think he likes to be ready for any stimulus that's thrown his way, but he waits for that stimulus to come to him. Then he deals with it. And he was kind of always learning on the job at Chelsea, waiting for all these things to hit him that he hadn't planned ahead of. Whereas I think Tuchel likes to get on top of it, and because of his, I think, yes, I do think he's got an advantage over Lampard at this stage of his career because of what he's been exposed to. As a coach, I think Lampard's got a world of experience as a player, but I think Lampard's kind of going through a process in basically relating things as they came at him as a manager. He was relating it to when he was a player, then trying to put himself in the player's shoes, then trying to deal with the problem. Tuchel's not got this glittering playing career that Lampard had. And he's kind of, obviously understands without that experience to fall back on, he's got to be proactive. He's got to get after people. He's got to get on top of things and almost swarm his players before anyone has any chance to ask questions. It's like, no, this is the way we're going to do things kind of thing. And he just likes to get on top of problems that way. So I think they're kind of different in that regard, but very similar in terms of it's about just being ready for anything. It's about being comfortable no matter what term, what unlikely turn an event might take, just being comfortable and ready for it, taking it in your stride. I think they're both very similar in that regard. There's an interesting thing that cropped up, actually, and I was thinking about Tuchel, and I was likening I was trying to watch some of his interviews first to type profile him, to get his personality before I read any of the backstory on him and all the things that came about. And the first thing one of the very first things that caught my attention was his interviews. He stands up doing his interviews on the pitch at Stamford Bridge or whatever, and he's constantly on his feet. He's constantly moving and ducking and diving for the questions, like physically moving his body. And it reminds me, when I was taught about this in profiling, this as a flow state, the best way to understand it is like known as something called the tennis hop. And it's basically when nearly all tennis players lead with this flow state. You have to in that game because it's so much agility is needed. And it's like when a tennis player is facing serve, they always do this tennis hop. They do this little sequence of 4 to 8 steps. Well, because you can't be stood still when a ball's coming down 130 miles an hour down the court. You've kind of already got to be in motion when that ball, and basically that's the way Lampard, but even more so Tuchel. And as soon as I put those two things together, I just see him now as a tennis player. I just imagine him having been a tennis player in a previous life. And yeah, it's just that thing of always being ready for anything. But if you imagine, it's just you always want that stimulus coming. You get so bored so easily if you're always waiting for that serve and it never comes, so to speak.
Yeah, we'll have to see if he does one of his post-match interviews dressed entirely in white soon, and then we can confirm that he will indeed be on centre court sometime soon. One thing that you kind of note about him, Mike, is that he comes across as very respectful of everybody that he encounters in the game. He's had rivalries with the likes of Pep, but Pep has recommended him before. They are great admirers of one another, and he claims anyway that he gets a lot of his principles from Hermann Badstuber, who is the former Bayern Munich defender, the father of the former Bayern Munich defender, and he came across him very early on in his managerial career And he says he taught him a lot of basics about respect, appreciation, punctuality, the right mindset when, talking to players and coaches at all levels. And one thing that he implemented at Dortmund was handshakes when greeting everyone, making sure that his players made eye contact in all conversations, and he reciprocated that as well. So it seems like those small touches that he brings to clubs also help foster that collective spirit. Although we should add that handshakes are probably at the moment elbow bumps, aren't they?
Yeah, well, yeah. It's interesting that you say that. Yeah, I think he's more of a people person than a logical person, which is not to say that the logic's a massive weakness. He goes around collecting these tactical principles and applying them. But this is not, he doesn't necessarily follow through the logic. That's the thing. That's why he needs his players to be able to logically solve problems for themselves on the pitch, because he's more of a people person. And yeah, that one-to-one respect and that being able to, for his, the way he makes decisions and the values that he works to, being able to look somebody in the eye is an important thing, and know that you've got that trust, and that, that somebody's not going to say one thing in front of your face and do something behind your back. I think that's a very, very important value for him. And I think that probably speaks to what he's doing in these little touches that he has, because it kind of fosters that, it's almost like, it's half the job. You put these principles in place, you put these ideas in place, and everybody's expected to adhere to them. You kind of catch someone out, somebody stands out like a sore thumb if they're not playing the game along those rules and along those lines. And so everybody knows where they stand with each other. And, we set these values of, this is the way we conduct to each other. This is how we show and know that we've got each other's respect. And I think that kind of goes to show that Tuchel is more of an emotional person. He's more of a people person than he is a logical problem-solving person.
And probably very important, I imagine, with a lot of the young players in that Chelsea squad as well, just to set high standards on a daily basis, even if you're, just having your tea.
Yeah. Well, there's been a mixture now. I think this was the thing towards the end of Lampard, is that it almost became a mixture of a dressing room, in some of the players that had been brought in, and the way that the transfer policies changed from the senior players start leaving that haven't played alongside Lampard and don't know Lampard, everything about him and what he stands for. And because he's not proactive and doesn't get on top of it, he waits for, stimulus to find him and then deals with it. I think, there was possibly elements of that dressing room, if the noises were to be believed before Lampard, that, though some of those players weren't on the same page as him. So it was an important thing for Tuchel to come in and get on top of that and be proactive in that regard. Also helps the fact I think that he, some of those new faces that have come into the Chelsea dressing room that don't necessarily have much background with Lampard are fully aware, having played in the German game with Tuchel and his reputation coming in, and I would have known a lot more about him than they actually knew about Lampard.
And one thing he did do when he first arrived was give everyone a clean slate. We saw Lampard, sticking to certain players, and I think some fans became a little bit tired of the same players week in, week out, even when the fixtures were coming thick and fast. Tuchel came in and almost immediately brought in a lot of the players who were in the cold and said, right, here's your chance to impress. Go on, tell me what, show me what you can do, and we'll go from there. And that kind of gives us an idea that he's not necessarily a man who's going to necessarily hold opinions and grudges for long. He's going to give everyone a fair crack of the whip. And if you don't do it over a longer period of time, then it's probably best you leave. But while you're at Chelsea, you're gonna get the opportunity at least to impress him.
Yeah, I think there's another part to this as well, though, that goes alongside the tactics. I think he likes to be elusive, and you can't be elusive with the same 11 players and the same system every week. I think he's a manager that likes to change, likes to adapt, likes to set up his team to suit a particular opposition, and have, again, we go back to improvisation and spontaneity, have that capacity to surprise an opponent because they don't necessarily know what you're going to do in advance. So the only way to achieve that is to make everybody feel involved and make everybody sure that you're going to play a part. There is going to be roles for you, and to some of the other sort of senior players or players that expect to be in the team week in, week out. That's not necessarily the case, because when we change systems, there might be a system somewhere down the line and a role that you would normally play that probably doesn't suit this game and this system and this particular moment in time. But I think it's really important for him to have that freedom to change it up. Because again, we go back to the adrenaline thing and the getting bored easily. You play the same way week in, week out, and then start getting the same results or the same problems reoccurring. That leads to boredom, it leads to staleness, and that leads to an unhappy Thomas Tuchel. He wants to know that if things aren't going according to plan or aren't going according to expectations, well, it's okay, he can just change it up for next week. Let's do something new and exciting again. He's always looking for new and exciting and being able to mix it up whenever it might appear that things could go stale or a game might become predictable.
And that also plays into the fact that he kind of drills down into the detail and knows a lot about each player's individual personality. There's a story about how he was managing Julian Nagelsmann at one point, who was at the time very injury prone. And I guess Tuchel, who himself had a recurring knee problem, probably saw shades of himself, but he told Nagelsmann to go and do some scouting for him for an opposition. And that obviously started off what we now know as a very successful managerial career. So clearly he's very good at spotting potential and unlocking the attributes in a player that will make them stand out, even if it is not on the pitch.
Yeah, I think individuality is the key bit there. I think, he's very much about connecting with individuals and understanding individuals, wanting to know each individual's story and knowing, how they might be motivated by their own story. We've touched on this a few times, as a flow state, it's not a flow state for Tuchel, but, as a strength, it is a strength. It is something he's very conscious about doing. He's understanding people's individual stories and then knowing, okay, what does this mean? How can I motivate this player? What might they need in order to get the best out, for me to get the best out of them and for them to really be enjoying the football. And to know everybody's individual stories is not necessarily just about the tactics. It can also be about, it's that adaptability again. It's that being able to change things up from week to week. And if you know a player's backstory, you might know how they might suddenly be able to do something that other people didn't expect because, they might have played in a different position previously and actually quite enjoyed it because he's had that conversation with them. So, this all, it really helps him to know players on an individual level and, just understand what motivates them.
Finally, Mike, on Thomas Tuchel, tactically flexible. We know he likes to mix things up. He likes to stay elusive as well. He sees the match as often like a game of chess. All of this kind of makes me think that he's very good in individual one-off games, which surely then means Champions League and possibly Champions League success in the future at Chelsea. How do you see him getting on, particularly in that competition? But also, I guess, putting themselves back as Premier League contenders next season.
It's interesting, actually. I mean, this is a dangerous thing to say after today when they've just been thumped 5-2 at home to West Brom. But I don't think that they're out of the... I think they've got a squeak of the Champions League this season, but just because of the sheer nature of the competition and the fact that on any given day, you turn up for 90 minutes, 180 minutes in the quarters and semis, but you turn up and just deliver a stellar performance at the right time and, get crucial goals at crucial times. Elusive managers, potentially, Zinedine Zidane is someone that, is basically not always been the most predictable in terms of the way he sets up. And, he's the kind of manager that, when you get that individual, when you're able to motivate a player for a specific occasion in a specific moment in time, I think, there's a lot to be gained from that. And that the Champions League is a competition that can reward some of the qualities that Thomas Tuchel's got. The more I'm looking into him, the more I'm thinking, I'm not sure he's got a Premier League title in him, that he could, sustain something for an entire season. Remains to be seen. But I think as a Champions League manager and a knockout manager and the adrenaline, because I think the other thing that comes from this is when you've got a manager that loves adrenaline so much, is such larger than life on the training ground, is so intense day in, day out, and knows how to motivate players in the way that he does. I think you get to that place where, you can play with the freedom on the biggest of stages at the real sort of moments of truth. And I think that's something else that Thomas Tuchel might be able to do. And it's certainly if Chelsea are managed, I think they're possibly on the kind of side of the draw because Manchester City and Bayern Munich are on the other side. And you know, if they're going to be underdogs in every game as well. Well, I mean, is it Porto they've got in the quarterfinals? But then, you know, any semi-final, whichever opponents, they would be underdogs. I think it's not a bad situation for them to be in, you know. And yeah, I think there's possibilities there. They're certainly, you know, they've got just as good a chance as anyone as it stands right now. And I think Tuchel's a manager that is capable of executing it.
If you like what you heard on Thomas Tuchel and you want to use all of the manager profiling tips and tricks that Mike has offered throughout the past 22 weeks, then Mike, there is a case study which should be very, very helpful.
Yeah, I've been doing manager profiling for about 9 months now since lockdown. Did a deep dive study on how to apply this and take myself away from sort of the rating side of betting and the data science. It's so difficult now with data science to make money from betting. And I've been really, taken aback and surprised by the results. It's been fantastic. So kind of put some of the basic principles together in a case study that's available as a free video on the site. Just click on the link in the description and submit your email and get your hands on that case study.